Good afternoon to all of you. So in my presentation, as said, I will go through very briefly in giving you an update of where we are with the candidate COVID-19 vaccine, in particular was approved, but also talking a little bit about what is the outlook. And indeed, I will cover different points that will highlight some of the main features around the benefit risk of this vaccine and other aspects such as real-world evidence studies in children and what we expect will be the impact of these vaccines on this pandemic. I will start with a summary slide that tells you a little bit what has been happening throughout this year. And just to remind you, the pandemic was declared mid-March last year in 2020. So it's more than 1 year that we're into this pandemic, and we still have a lot of work to be done. But just to say that even before the pandemic was declared by the WHO, the EMA proactively established a task force bringing together all the expertise in the European network in order to make sure that we can give a rapid response and facilitate the development of vaccines and therapeutics for tackling this pandemic. And throughout last year, we have gone through a huge amount of conversation with developers in order to discuss all their plan, the design of the clinical trial, and to make sure that really rapid feedback on regulatory aspect is given, and this is for the benefit of vaccines and therapeutics that can be approved as rapidly as possible. And I'm very glad also to say, as it is illustrated in this slide, that 4 vaccines have been approved so far. So these 4 vaccines are divided in 2 different types of technologies. Comirnaty, so the first one that was approved on the 21st of December 2020, is being developed by Pfizer and BioNTech, and the Moderna one, which was approved a few days later, are vaccines that are based on the messenger RNA technology. So in other words, they are based on the small molecule, which is the messenger RNA, which contains the instructions and the code for producing the spike protein of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which is the virus that is causing this pandemic. And as you know, the spike protein is a key protein on the surface of the virus that allows this virus to be spreading into our body, infect and damage the cells, particularly of our lungs, but not only. So this was the mechanism that is being used by this vaccine in order to allow that the spike protein is produced into the cells in our body and then is expressed and released, and this causes an immune reaction that will give protection whenever in the future we will be encountering the virus. Other 2 vaccines have been approved, one from AstraZeneca and more recently one from Janssen, and you see here on the chart below, the AstraZeneca vaccine was approved on the 29th of January this year, and the Janssen one on the 11th of March. These 2 vaccines deliver the same message, but in a different way. So here the carrier is an innocuous virus, so a non-replicated adenovirus that enter into the cells, and then into the cell, once into the cells, allows the cells to rebuild the spike protein, expose it to the immune system, and then trigger an immune reaction that will confer protection. So it's a different way, but at the end of the day, the message is the same. All these vaccines are able to confer immunity against one of the immunodominant protein of the SARS-CoV-2 virus and allow us to be protected from infection from this virus. Looking now into the benefits and the risk of these vaccines and starting from the efficacy side, and just let me remind you, everybody, that all these COVID-19 vaccines that have been approved in the European Union have an established positive benefit-risk balance in the prevention of COVID-19 disease. And we have seen in clinical trials that the messenger RNA vaccines were really efficacious in very large clinical trials in preventing symptomatic COVID of any severity. Also, the viral vector vaccine demonstrated really high level of protection against symptomatic COVID. Often there is the tendency to try to compare the results from all these different studies. However, we have to be careful in doing that because these vaccines have been studied all in different trials. Therefore, it's not so easy and it's not possible to make really direct comparison of the efficacy rates reported in these trials. And the reasons are multiple. It based on different geography where the trials have been conducted, different point in times, different viruses that were circulating, including also the variants, different attack rates, and different definition of the symptoms that would trigger a PCR testing to really understand whether COVID-19 was happening. So again, we have to be careful and we have to be mindful of the fact that in any case, all these vaccines demonstrated really high efficacy in the clinical trials. Data on prevention of severe disease, hospitalization, and death from the clinical trials are limited despite the considerable size of these studies, but all are showing a trend toward high level of protection, which is extremely encouraging and extremely important as showing what could be the impact of these vaccines. We have now limited information from the clinical trials with respect to protection against emerging variants, but in a few minutes, I will give you more details of where we stand with that. Also, some real-world data with respect to prevention of infection and symptomatic disease have been reported, but also there, more data needed for proper estimation. But let me say that these data are extremely encouraging and would show that this vaccine not only have a big impact in preventing symptomatic COVID, but also in preventing infection. And I will give you more details in one of the next slides. When it comes to safety, overall, all these vaccines have shown a good safety profile, which is overall comparable to what we've seen with other vaccines that have been developed or are in use for preventing other infectious diseases. The most common side effects that have been detected are usually mild or moderate and temporary. These include pain, tenderness at the injection site, headache, tiredness, muscle pain, general feeling of being unwell, chills, fever, joint pain, and nausea. So the typical side effects that are related to what we generally call reactogenicity, which is very much something that we see with the majority of vaccines. On top of this, we have seen very rare but severe allergic reactions that have occurred in people receiving some of these vaccines. And these are occurring in less than 1 in 100,000 people. So they are very rare, and there are good ways of taking care that there will be no problematic or consequences after these occur, and therefore medical intervention can be put in place very rapidly in order to handle these events. Most recently, we have seen very rare events of severe thrombosis combined with thrombocytopenia after AstraZeneca vaccination, and they have occurred in around 1 in a million people. We don't know yet if these events are related to the vaccine, but we are investigating, and Peter Arlett later on will talk to you more about this. Long-term safety is also being monitored, and we will continue to do that throughout months and years after vaccination. And lastly, on this slide, there is a reference to the full scientific details and product information for all these vaccines that is available on the EMA website, and you're very free to consult them and get more information around what are the information for the prescriber and what was the scientific assessment that underpinned the evaluation and the approval of these vaccines. As I mentioned, data from real world have been emerging and will be emerging in the future. And these data are quite important in order to complement the data that we have seen from clinical trials. And the real world monitor complements what is the EMA regular safety monitoring activities as an important tool to detect anything that is happening from the pharmacovigilance side. Real world data can inform vaccination campaign and could make changes in the current practices on how vaccines have been used or will be used. These studies in particular are providing and will provide information on how long protection lasts after vaccination, how well the vaccine prevents severe COVID-19, how well it protects vulnerable groups such as immunocompromised people and pregnant women, and whether it prevents asymptomatic cases and block transmission. As you know, this is a very important point to consider also in light of what will be the overall public health measure that will have to be put in place in the long term, and by when we would expect to return to normality and really end this pandemic once and for all. In terms of the preliminary data that we have seen around the real-world evidence, there have been at least 4 studies that have been made available in the literature, and they are coming essentially from Israel and the United Kingdom. We have done a preliminary assessment of all these studies, and we felt that these early data are indeed promising. The data coming from Israel using the Comirnaty vaccine are showing that this vaccine is able to prevent infection on top of symptomatic disease and severe disease, which is a very important evidence that is coming up. And as indeed, we are really glad to see that the prevention of infection is very high. And also studies from the United Kingdom are showing that both the AstraZeneca and the Comirnaty vaccine substantially reduce the risk of hospitalization. We are talking about more than 80% efficacy in this respect. But these are preliminary data, and more will be coming. That will be extremely important to get more solid ground in this respect. What this data are telling us that overall for the messenger RNA vaccine, the efficacy from the clinical trials as seen after the second dose has been shown also in these effectiveness studies, which corroborate the importance of giving a second dose with the messenger RNA vaccine. With respect to the AstraZeneca vaccine, the initial data that we have looked into are showing really high level of protection from COVID, including severe disease after a first dose. And these are also important information that complement what we know already from clinical trials. And also, as you know, a larger clinical study that is ongoing in the Americas has delivered some preliminary results that were made public by AstraZeneca this week. And these data will point to really high level of efficacy in the prevention of symptomatic COVID-19, including in the elderly, which, as you know, was something that was missing in the initial clinical trials that supported the initial approval of this vaccine. So really good news on the way also in this respect. Let's talk a little bit about studies in children. At the moment, as you know, there are no vaccine approved for younger children. The only one that has an approval for any pediatric population is the Comirnaty vaccine, which can be given above 16 years of age, while all the other vaccines are approved just for adults above 18 years of age. The vaccines, as always happen, have been tested first in adolescents, and then progressively they will go down with age with clinical trials that will recruit children below 12 years of age in a staggered approach. Now, we don't know exactly when this data will be submitted because the studies are ongoing, but we already heard that at least for some of these vaccines like Comirnaty, probably the data in adolescents will be available very soon. And we are really looking forward assessing them and see whether we can authorize also this vaccine for the adolescent population as a whole. And we are also looking into what the other vaccine will be doing in terms of pediatric development so that we can really understand as soon as possible whether the benefit risk of this vaccine will be positive also in the different pediatric populations. Few words now about the other vaccines that are in the pipeline that have not yet been approved but already started the rolling review. As you know, the rolling review is a system that we have in place in order to speed up the development of promising vaccine after we receive sufficient evidence that the vaccines are promising and indeed there are good chances they may end up being approved. So the first one that I will mention is a vaccine developed by a company called Novavax, and you see here written the code of this vaccine. This vaccine uses a more traditional technology, so it's based on the actual protein of the spike that is put together with an adjuvanting system, which is essentially a small molecule that help boosting the immune response so that the immune response is stronger and able to protect in a better way from exposure to the virus. And this vaccine, as you know, already presented in the public result from clinical trials, which appear to be extremely promising. So we are looking forward advancing with the evaluation of these vaccines in the coming weeks. Another vaccine that is under development and quite advanced is the one from CureVac. It started also rolling review in February this year. It's another messenger RNA vaccine, so it contains the messenger RNA information for the spike protein contained in lipid nanoparticles, similarly to what we're seeing for Comirnaty and the Moderna vaccine. And right now, as we speak, there is a large clinical trials recruiting subjects in Europe and in South and Latin America that we really hope will reach good result pretty soon so that we can swiftly move on with the potential approval of this vaccine as well. A third vaccine for which we started the rolling review is the Sputnik vaccine developed by Gamaleya. This vaccine started the rolling review not long ago, so at the beginning of March. It's a vaccine that is based on the adenovirus concept, similarly to Janssen and AstraZeneca. However, it uses two different adenoviruses, and these two different adenoviruses are the carrier that contain the code for the spike protein, but they are not given simultaneously. So first, subjects will receive a dose of the adeno26 vector, and after 3 weeks, they will receive a booster with the adeno5 vector. In this way, they are able to boost even a stronger immune response and potentially high level of protection as well. And again, also with this vaccine, we are engaging with the company and looking forward defining a timetable that could allow to come out with the approval of this vaccine in a timely manner. One important concern that has been emerging since few months now is what is going to happen with the variants. As you know, as all viruses, also the SARS-CoV-2 can change over time. And we have seen that indeed this virus has been changing quite a lot since it has been coming up as a human virus. And this is something that is not surprising, and we have to expect that. So it's very important that we continue to monitor how the virus evolves over time. And very importantly, that we monitor the performance of the vaccine to make sure that all the vaccines that we have are still able to protect from all the variants that might be emerging over time. And in order to be proactive together with developers, we are already working on the possibility of coming up with new version of the approved vaccines that take into account any of the variants that will be considered or major concern or that might be causing a high burden of disease in the European Union. And we think that with this proactive work, we can be ready then to rapidly approve such new vaccine whenever we have sufficient evidence. And in this sense, we have come up with a guidance to developers that really describe what we would expect to be seen in terms of clinical development and pharmaceutical development for this new variant vaccine. And let me say that we do not need large clinical trials. So essentially, in a way that is similar to what we've been doing for decades with the influenza vaccines, what we would expect is to see a comparison of the immune response of the new variant vaccine against the variant virus to the original vaccine against the original virus. And if the immune response is consistently similar, then we believe that the vaccine will be able to confer the same level of protection and will be therefore approved. What do we know right now about the performance of the vaccines that are already approved against these variants? There are some clinical trials that have shown that some of these vaccines, at the very least, are able to protect from some of these variants, in particularly the B117 variant that is circulated in the European Union and in the United Kingdom. And there we have seen clinical trial data that really show that some of these vaccines will protect in the same way as they do against the original strain. And we got also some data in terms of real world evidence that show that also the messenger RNA vaccine are able to protect exactly in the same way against this variant. As you know, there are other variants that have been emerging from various parts of the world, in particular the B1351 that is emerging in South Africa. And we have seen there from some clinical trials that some of the vaccines will be very good in protecting from COVID-19 of any severity, while others may lose some of their protection against mild disease. But at the end of the day, the data that we have would suggest that all vaccines should still be able to protect against severe disease, against also these variants. And also data from the laboratory are showing that in many cases, there is cross-neutralization of the antibodies. So the antibodies are able also to neutralize these variants, even if maybe with a bit less efficiency, but still to a level that is supposed to confer the same level of protection. And a similar discussion could be done with respect to the other variant that has emerged from Brazil, which is the variant called the P1, for which we don't have clinical data available, but the data in the laboratory are supportive of the fact that most vaccines will confer good protection against this variant too. There are a number of pending questions that are very important in the context of the mass vaccination campaigns that are taking place today. One of the questions that has been coming up repeatedly is whether we need 2 doses for individuals who had a history of COVID-19. And some studies have already shown preliminarily that in many cases, probably a single dose would be sufficient, as indeed 2 doses will not confer any additional benefit in terms of the immune response that can be achieved after the first dose. However, we do recognize that this population is very heterogeneous, and the immune response to the natural exposure to the virus can be extremely variable. Therefore, for us as regulators, it's very difficult to come up as yet with any clear-cut recommendation in this respect. Another question that has emerged repeatedly is around the interval between the 2 doses. And with the shortage of supply that we have right now, some public health authorities have decided to wait before giving the second dose a bit longer than what has been done in the clinical trials. And also here, we don't have really good clinical data or real-world evidence that would suggest how long you will be protected after a single dose of a messenger RNA vaccine. And therefore, we would like to caution around not extending too much the interval between the 2 doses, at least for the messenger RNA vaccines, while some flexibility, of course, would be well understood. A different discussion would apply to the viral vector vaccine, because there, as you know, with the AstraZeneca clinical trials, there are data really supporting the fact that you could give the second dose much longer, even after 12 weeks. And this is what is included in the product information of this vaccine. And as you know, the Janssen vaccine has been developed as a single shot vaccine. So the idea is to give it only once, at least in the context of this emergency situation. But we are looking forward to see more data in this regard. Another important aspect that has been emerged has been, in order to facilitate flexibility in the vaccination campaign, can you give the second dose of another vaccine than the vaccine that was initially administered? And the concept of going into this kind of heterologous boosting is really appealing. But unfortunately, for the time being, we don't have sufficient clinical evidence in order to make any clear-cut recommendation from the regulatory standpoint. But we look forward working with developers and public health agencies and other stakeholders to see if data can be generated and whether these could inform how to use this vaccine during these campaigns. Lastly, but importantly, the use in vulnerable group, particularly immunocompromised subjects, is still an area that is not fully explored, and we're looking forward getting more data in order to have a good understanding on what is the level of protection that can be reached with the vaccine in these different populations, and to better inform what kind of strategies can be put in place. So as we have been saying, it's very clear what would be the immediate benefit for people in terms of vaccine coverage. And of course, protection from symptomatic disease is what we have seen systematically in clinical trials and would be the obvious benefit of all these vaccines. And of course, if fewer people are getting sick, so they will not develop symptom of COVID-19, particularly among high-risk individuals and the elderly, which are quite badly affected by the pandemic. This will, of course, would alleviate the huge burden of disease associated with COVID-19 and the healthcare system and will decrease the mortality, which, let me say, even today, when we see around 3,000 deaths a day across the European Union, this is really unacceptable. And it's very important that we move on rapidly in vaccinating those that are at risk. The preliminary data that are coming from real-world evidence from Israel are also showing that these vaccines have the ability not only to protect from the burden of disease associated with COVID, but also to reduce the spread of the virus. So we need more data to confirm this, but I think this is a very important factor. And again, another signal of the value of the vaccine in containing and putting an end to this pandemic. So let me say that overall, vaccination is crucial in order to beat the pandemic. However, we should not forget that before there is an high coverage and there is a massive reduction in the spread of the virus around us, it will be very important that we maintain some of the social distancing measures that are in place, and we continue to use face masks at least until we get to a point where the majority of people have been vaccinated to a level that really we can really contain the spread of the virus and the deadly consequences that it brings. Just to give you a bit of an overview of what we are doing right now, so far we have been interacting with 54 developers of vaccine, and 30 of these vaccine companies have been interacting with the EMA COVID task force. 42 rapid scientific advice have been delivered for vaccines for COVID-19. As mentioned before, a guidance for developers on how to develop a new vaccine that would tackle the variant has been rapidly issued and agreed also with international regulators. And discussion is ongoing also with respect to what to do for second generation vaccines, so vaccines that have not yet been approved and may have difficulties in running the same type of clinical trials that we've seen so far happening. The importance of post-authorization studies for both effectiveness and safety cannot be understated. Is extremely important. And again, Peter Allen will talk to you more about this. And as said, the international collaboration with WHO and other regulators worldwide has been really beneficial and really important in the context of this pandemic in order to fine-tune our perspective and making sure that there is global alignment with respect to requirements. So let me conclude by stating that indeed all approved vaccines in the EU have shown excellent level of protection against COVID-19 disease, that we have preliminary real-world data that are suggesting that the vaccine are really good in preventing severe disease, hospitalization, but also to reduce transmission and to reduce infection. And we need confirmation for that, but this is a very important finding. Most side effects are mild to moderate in severity, and they go away within a matter of few days. All these vaccines have been approved according to the conditional marketing authorization process and scheme, which means that companies will have to provide more evidence after approval, and we are looking forward reviewing all the additional data that are already coming in and we are looking into in order to convert one day this conditional marketing authorization to full marketing authorization. As said, variant strain of the SARS-CoV-2 are emerging, and in order to be proactive, we already defined how we could approve updated version of the vaccines that we already have. Regulators and developers are working together in order to ensure that all these necessarily updates can be made rapidly and efficiently so that we will always have vaccines that are effective. And last, vaccination remains critical to control the pandemic. We will play our role, and it's very important that vaccination campaigns go on as swiftly as possible in the European Union and around all the world. Thank you very much.